Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the library. It's good to see all of you. I'm assuming the audience is, Professor Fulton's class, kind of, stacking the deck a little bit. So it's good to see everyone on a Monday morning. My name is Troy Swanson. I'm the library department chair. Happy Veterans Day. This is sort of connected in to Veterans Day, trying to, be part of the conversation. It is a unique privilege when we get to have one of our own faculty members share his or her research, his research in this case, talking about the home front, World War I. And I think a great thing, so many times we're in classes with faculty members, but we don't see the actual scholarship that our faculty do because so many of our faculty really focus on teaching. But this comes from Josh's dissertation, actual historical work. He'll take us through, I think, a really interesting story about Illinois on the home front during World War I. So thank you, Josh. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you. Well, hi, everybody. It's good to see everyone, and yes, happy Veterans Day, and thanks to all who've served. Thank you to Dr. Troy Swanson, thank you to Dr. Tara Jacobson, thank you to Dr. Cindy Anderson and others who made this possible and supported this. So the title of this, yes, is based off partly of some dissertation research that I had done about First World War Illinois. When you go into an archive, you will occasionally have what are called finding aids, and you'll start to look through things, and you have this distinct thing of like, okay, I think I'm gonna find this. Then you start to go through it, and you're like, wait, what? What was this other thing? This other thing. What are we doing? What are we finding? What are we seeing? I think at one point I found a file that said disloyal citizens. So I was researching the state government of Illinois at the time, and I went, wait a minute, there's a disloyal citizens file? That's kind of strange. What's going on with that? And so I would find these little bits that kind of led me into learning more about what was going on both in Illinois and around America during the era of the First World War. And a lot of it had to do with food, and a lot of it had to do with recipes and drink, and a lot of it had to do with how you get a message out to the public at that time. So, for example, a lot of this will have some images. So I find images from the era of World War I to be utterly fascinating, for many reasons, right? Much like today, I'm sure we all have our own memes or cartoons or different videos that we find to be interesting or engaging. Same thing. So for example, this one here, it says, "Little Americans, do your bit, eat cornmeal mush." I don't know, the idea of a child saluting a bowl of cereal seems a little bit strange to me. I mean, I've had some good cornflakes in my time. I've had some good Raisin Bran, but that seems a little bit awkward. I'm not necessarily going to be saluting my breakfast every particular day. It kind of made me wonder, what's going on with that? So, these kinds of images would become pretty common, right? For many reasons. One, food connected, but also, two, attempting truly to tell every American that there's a lot of ways in which you can take normalized behaviors for you and make them wartime related. Now, here are two others that particularly stood out to me as I was doing some of this work. So the first on the left has more to do with the overall government process at the time, and the one on the right does a bit too. So most of these images are from the Illinois State Archives. The one here on the right is from the Wisconsin State Archives. But the one there on the left was a government pamphlet that was put together for the time of war. And I looked at the title and the front part of it, and it struck me as kind of awkward, of how to plan and hold a patriotic meeting. Because, there's obviously going to be one right way to do that. Wait, what? That seems a little strange to me. that you need to have a pamphlet for how to be properly American, right? That the government was going to teach you in time of war how to best do that. And the one there on the right, which gets more into this process of food, I think speaks volumes. So it's a recipe book, the title of which is Loyalty Christmas Candies. Now, I see the Santa figure. I'm not really sure what he's doing with his hand. I'm not really sure what's going on there. However, again, the title of this is Loyalty Christmas Candies. So, as it says down there at the bottom, it says endorsed by Women's Conservation Committee, Illinois State Council. So state councils of defense were wartime governments for states both in Illinois and around America during the era of the First World War. So this is a government-approved how to have a proper Christmas. That's interesting, the idea that there would be a distinctly sanctioned version of a religious holiday that the government's getting involved in, right? To me, I found that something to explore further. Now, there's a few other images here kind of as we get going that to me spoke a lot. First, we see a drawing of a larger-than-life U.S. soldier. And if you can kind of tell, he's holding a massive sword, okay? Now, this actually, the one you see there on the left, was part of a series of drawings that were done after the food administrator, Herbert Hoover, had given a big speech about the importance of food conservation. And much of it had to do with the idea of hoarding is bad. And so these were then drawn up, and they were basically created almost as pamphlet or sort of leaflets. Think of them as kind of like memes that you could print out and hand out to people, right? And it was awkward, to me at least, of you've got folks with what looks like food supplies in front of the Capitol. Now, they're supposed to be hoarders. And that looks like an American soldier drawing his sword to go after and kill them, right? Which seems quite harsh, quite a thing, right? They're making it pretty clear. If you hoard in America during wartime, there are very, very bad consequences that are headed your way. Now, the one we see here to the right is depicting individuals who, of course, seem like they are going through horrific and tragic food insecurity, which was a true reality for many across the world during the era of the First World War. And so they were attempting to get the word out to the public of, come on now, we can help out a bit. We can do a little bit here. Now, America didn't get involved in the First World War right when that war began, right? First World War begins, what's up?
In 1914.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. First World War begins in 1914, but America doesn't get involved in that war until
1917.
That is correct, Simon. Now, the First World War, when it begins, becomes a brutal reality for the soldiers who will endure it, particularly on the Western Front, but for the entirety of the conflict. The casualties were overwhelming. I think specifically of the first day of the Battle of the Somme often when I think about how difficult the reality of the war truly was. The British will send, so this was a battle that happened, the first day at least of the battle was July 1st, 1916. The British will send nearly 120,000 soldiers over the line to attack the Germans. Half are killed or wounded within about 2 hours or less. It was absolutely terrifying. No, America between 1914 and 1917, we proclaim ourselves to be neutral. But in many ways, we're kind of neutral-ish. We're neutral adjacent because we provide assistance to the British, we provide assistance to the French. We do get involved in conflicts. We invade Mexico twice during that particular time. We send soldiers to Veracruz. and fight a battle there. And then we eventually will participate in something called the Punitive Expedition to Mexico. And we get concerned. We get concerned over Germany, over their use of submarines and their attacks against civilians, so that by the time you get to early 1917, you will see a movement towards war, which will be supported by April of that year. Now, the image you see here to the right, this is another interesting one from the Illinois State Archives. There were food displays, right? So a big part of the American wartime experience during World War I was the idea that Americans, if you weren't going to be joining the military, that you could be taking your normal daily experiences and channeling that labor into wartime service. And so you would see demonstrations commonly and constantly of how you could do that. So there would be food shows, and so this one is showing individuals how you can use milk products and dairy products to be able to do this. Now, again, when the war began for America, the concern was, okay, we've got to get over to Europe quickly. How do we mobilize quickly? How do we ramp up production? How do we bring individuals into the service? How do we use our resources? Well, part of that's going to involve increasing the resources of the state, and part of it's going to involve partnering with other organizations or private organizations that we think will help us in this cause. And there were many that we would partner with. So, for mobilizing the military, pretty early on, the government enacted what was called the Selective Service Act and began a draft to bring individuals into the service. Now, the majority of individuals in the wartime army in the U.S. during World War I were drafted. Now, the Selective Service, the title is always interesting. My father, who passed away a few years ago, was drafted and ended up serving in Vietnam. And I remember him telling me, of course, you know, it's the Selective Service, right? They were concerned about draft riots and difficulties. And so when you get a letter, he would always say, he's like, yeah, I got the letter. And it said, congratulations, you've been selected amongst the many fine men of your community. And he always got a chuckle at that. But again, that's the majority of individuals who are going to serve in World War I, is that they're going to be drafted. And you will see the American military deployed to France, marching actually in Paris at the 4th of July and fighting by the fall. You would see at home private organizations that would take on sort of state functions in what we today might consider very questionable practices. A good example of that would be what was called the American Protective League, or APL. Now, the American Protective League associated itself with the Department of Justice in the United States, but it was a private organization. And they claimed by the end of the war that they had about 250,000 members. And what they argued was that it was their job to provide assistance in making sure that there was no industrial sabotage or difficulty. In many ways, it simply was a group of upper middle class individuals who were very opposed to what was seen as labor radicalism of the day. Now, they weren't supposed to detain people, they weren't supposed to carry arms. Of course, they did both. And questions of civil liberties certainly are very reasonable to ask. Now, there were other organizations as well. There was the YMCA, the YWCA, of course, the Red Cross also. Now, overall, when thinking about the process of mobilization, though, it is both at the federal level, it is at the state level, and it is at the local level. Now, that's a lot, right? That's a lot even now. But trying to do this here with no computers and no cell phones meant that you had a lot of overlapping agencies that felt it was their job to do something. And so what you ended up with at the state level were a series of what were called state councils of defense, and women's committees of state councils of defense that kind of acted to bring all the resources together and to funnel the resources to the right way, spaces and places during the war. Now, where food comes in is that the federal government is going to create something called the Food Administration. And it's going to be led by a future president by the name of Herbert Hoover. And the idea is they're going to oversee a robust effort to conserve food, and they're also going to oversee an effort to be able to provide assistance for food labor. They're going to support that. But again, much of it's going to be centered on this idea of conservation. Now, Herbert Hoover is an interesting figure. He became president in 1928. He's president when the Great Depression happens. He's not often viewed in a very positive light, particularly after the Bonus March. But during the era of World War I, he's viewed quite positively in the U.S. Hoover was a big believer in voluntarism, the idea that communities, businesses, organizations that weren't the government should volunteer to provide oversight and assistance in really pretty much any case for anything. And he very much is going to attempt, while head of the Food Administration, to really imbue that administration with that same mindset. I know that oftentimes if I talk about the history of food in war, the phrase that will often be used is the idea of rationing. And we think often of World War II and ration books and structure by the state. Now, World War II, that absolutely happens. You have what's called the Office of Price Administration. You literally have prices that are going to be set. You're going to have a clear series of legal rationing that you must follow. Now, not everybody followed it. There was, of course, separate markets and all that stuff. But that's not the case during World War I. Hoover will oversee an organization of voluntarism. So the state has now gotten into the business of wanting to tell the public, you've got to conserve food, but we're going to expect you to do it voluntarily because we believe in your ability as an American to volunteer and serve. The interesting part about it, though, is once I dug more into the research, I found that while, yes, the state expected the public to volunteer, they also created a series of checks because they were scared as all heck that they weren't actually going to volunteer. And so there's a civil liberties issue that kind of goes in with some of that part. Now, if you see here, it says U.S. Food Administration booth, American Library Association meeting. There you go, American Library Association. There you go. In Saratoga, New York, it says July 1918. So, libraries, schools, other public spaces are going to be absolutely key platforms for the Food Administration during World War I to be able to get their messaging out, to be able to dialogue with the public. I mean, think of it today, right? Of if someone or a group wants to get their messaging out, there are platforms to do that. Most of them involve our phones and social media and all that stuff, and that's fine. But if you want to get the word out on stuff here, you're going to do it through these kinds of public spaces where people will go to, where they can interact with, where they can see these kinds of things. And the Food Administration cannot do this all itself. They will have to rely on the state councils of defense, and they will look specifically to the women's committees to be able to operate this. And they will look specifically to the county auxiliaries, so not just state level, but county level, both in Illinois and across the country, to be able to get this word out about the importance of food conservation. It really is quite fascinating how far they take this voluntarism and how far they strongly emphasize the importance of being able to have shows, to demonstrate, and to dialogue with the public. So these are others. The previous was from the Illinois State Archives. These are as well. You can see here, these are photos of different food shows around the country. So the Food Administration in Illinois has hundreds of photographs in the Illinois State Archives. And a lot of it was of different food shows that existed around the country in 1918. All right, so we see one here to the right. It says library food show. So they have different demonstrations of different kinds of foods. This one is looks like in a much bigger setting. And again, the emphasis was on putting the public into a position to be able to see these kinds of things. Now, another aspect of this was, again, not only showing the public, but also getting the public involved. So much of the marketing, much of the propaganda here is going to be directly aimed, it's going to be very gender. It's going to be directly aimed at women. It's going to be directly aimed particularly at individuals who were considered to be married. And the idea was that women could join the women's committees of the Council of Defense. They could join conservation committees and could participate in this process of attempting to convince the public that food conservation was a critical thing that everyone could be involved in. I found this ad in a newspaper. So Chronicling America, if anybody's interested, is a great resource for looking at newspapers. But this is an ad. It says the Hoover All dress. So if you were a woman who was involved in the Food Administration, it was common for these food shows for these women to be wearing this particular kind of wartime uniform. And I find the start of the advertisement. So this was a company advertising, we'll pre-make the uniforms for you. And it was advertising, as you see, if you want to be patriotic, wear the new Hoover All dress, right? So patriotic dresses, right, is what this company is advertising. And if you actually look at advertisements from the wartime era, you will find a lot of that where companies will show you how if you buy their product, how if you purchase their item, you will be a good patriot, right? You know, when you do this kind of thing. Now, much of this, again, of this process of getting the word out, right? The Food Administration can only do so much. They're going to need help. They need PR. And the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, is going to be the folks who are going to help them to be able to do that. Today, of course, we use all kinds of platforms to get messaging out. So did they in 1917 and 1918. Specifically, when it comes to food, or labor for food, they're going to use posters commonly. Because the idea would be, if you're in public, you're going to see these things. And so you can see the message, you can see what is required, you can see about an event coming up, or a program that you can be involved in. This was a key way for the government to be able to get its wartime messaging out, and for these private agencies to get their wartime messaging out. The Library of Congress has this one. This is a fascinating one. It says, Farm to Win Over There. And the title of it, it says, Join the U.S. Boys Working Reserve. So they were desperately concerned in America that they wouldn't have enough individuals on farms to meet the needs of increased production. So they actually started a program called the Boys Working Reserve, where the idea was you would take young men, it says 16 to 21, because that was when you could join the Army, but 16 to 21, and send them out to the farm fields. And the idea was that they would literally deploy to random farms all throughout the country, and they would work. Now, the state councils would oversee this. I've had a chance to look at the records of the farmers. So the farmers would write into the state, you know, how's it going with the young man who's now helping them on the farm. And largely it's all positive. You know, there's a little bit of, you know, the young man who won't, you know, doesn't like to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. Who likes to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning? You know, come on. So there is a little bit of that. But posters were big. Public lectures. Part of what they saw this as being was informational outreach, right? That was a big thing. Pamphlets, right? There was a strong newspaper network, both in Illinois and around the country, to increase advertisements to keep the messaging going. Probably one of the most famous parts of these was what was called the 4-Minute Men. These were a series of speakers who they would go to pretty much any organization, any theater that you can imagine at that time, and they would give preset, government-approved wartime speeches about food conservation or pretty much anything else designed to support the country. You would get business displays. I always find this one interesting. When I was a kid, we would go downtown by what was then Marshall Fields in Chicago, and you'd walk around, and it was cool to see the lights and everything, at least to me at the time. But admittedly, I'd have to think that if I was a kid walking around in 1917 and this was the window display, I might get a little scared, right? I mean, it does look a little scary. It's like, okay, man, how you doing? Great. But what is this a reflection of? This is a reflection of a wartime culture that their view was that you could use and should be able to use business storefronts in high traffic areas to be able to convince the public of the importance of your cause. And so that very much is going to be the case for the Food Administration and for the conservation movement, right? This voluntary conservation movement that existed in the country at the time. So that's a storefront, but again, there's many others. Here is an example of a billboard. So you would see these, you don't have as maybe many billboards because they don't have the highways that we do, but you would certainly see billboards with these kinds of advertisements and slogans and speeches, right? This kind of thing. Food, don't waste it. Yeah, the phrase waste when it comes to this process of food conservation was actually pretty central. They produce a lot around the idea of decreasing your waste as much as possible, to the point where they even created a series of short plays where the idea was that the actors in the plays were very, one actor would not know that waste was bad, the other would attempt to convince them that waste was really terrible and hey, don't waste your food, right, that kind of thing. But again, that's a platform of that time, is that you can create short plays, have them performed, right, again, to further get your messaging out. They even used silent films. The Committee of Public Information had a division of films where they would produce short silent films to be able to spread the messaging about food conservation, but also broadly the process of America's wartime experiences. Yeah, the National Archives actually has a lot of those on their YouTube channel. If you,
Silent films you're talking about?
yes, they have a lot of those on there, and you can go and see them on the National Archives YouTube channel. Now, the image that you see here is actually from the inside of a train, all right? So you've got jars or cans, right? So part of what you would also see was, since travel in 1917, 1918, across the country would often involve train travel, the government would use trains as a way to dialogue with the public. So if you wanted to send an exposition around the nation, you would do it on a train, right? You would do it on a train. And so this is one of the things, this is one of the ways in which the public is going to be more actively informed about how they can get involved in conservation. But again, it's public spaces. It's places of high interaction, right? For those who study marketing or advertising, right, there's similar precepts today, right? You want the most folks to see something, right? If you have a business, right, you want lots of foot traffic, right? That kind of thing. So here, how are they going to get the messaging out? They're going to do it at libraries. They're going to do it at colleges, right? Because they want young people to get active and to be involved. They're going to have food displays where they literally show you, hey, have you never canned food before? Here's examples of what it looks like, right? So here's how you can do this. They're going to have food shows, right? Literal, what they called patriotic food shows. The biggest was in Chicago in January of 1918 at the Coliseum. But they're going to have places where you can go and see these recipes demonstrated. You're going to see these recipes performed. The CPI is actually going to sponsor a series of what were called Great War Expositions. One of the biggest will be in Chicago, but there's others around the country at the time. And the idea was food conservation was viewed as a part of this overall process for, again, folks to get involved and help win the war. Yes, there will be demonstration kitchens, and there will even be patriotic food trucks, which I find so fascinating, of the idea of you go to a food truck and you eat government-approved food, right? It's kind of an interesting reality. Now, if you look here, so here is an image. This is a woman standing in front of, and it says, "School Posters, Patriotic Food Show." So schools, particularly high schools especially, were often looked at as central partners in promoting aspects of food conservation and the war overall. Now, the Patriotic Food Show that was in Chicago, a lot of this involved, again, information outreach. The idea was, if we can get the information out there, the public will conserve more. But again, they're doing a poster sort of demonstration, and I think it only demonstrates how important the posters were, right, at that time. Now, I'll admit, the next image, to me, I do enjoy a great deal, because how can you not enjoy flying sweet potatoes, right? Flying sweet potatoes are the best, right? I mean, I think we all can agree. There is a certain level of amusement, right? You got to have a little fun, even in the midst of terrible times and even in the midst of difficult situations, right? And so part of what you would see in some of the photos of these displays that were preserved was folks in 1917, 1918 trying to have a little fun. And I take this as, that's 1918 wartime fun. They're doing their best with that kind of thing, right? I think in the back you can see there it says plant a garden, right? You've got the potatoes, maybe is that onions? I'm not sure, but it's potatoes dressed up as if they're serving, right? That kind of thing, And the other thing that this speaks, I think, or says, is it conveys that this is also wartime labor, right? Being involved in putting something like this together was a way in which you could serve, was a way in which you could support the war, and you're going to have many folks who are going to get involved in that. Now, there are other displays as well, right? So we showed that individual who was dressed up and who was in a business display. You would see static displays in businesses around the country. So oftentimes it's going to be either historical themes connected to food, it's going to be literal posters with aspects of food in front of it. It really is going to vary a bit, but you're going to see lots of different kinds of demonstration material like this that individuals would have been exposed to during that time period. Now, I was mentioning the idea of the wartime expositions. So that's Grant Park. That doesn't look like Grant Park, does it? No. So, as an example, expositions were a common way for states, for the government, for organizations to dialogue with Americans at the end of the 1800s and into the early 1900s. This was a common way to do it. You had county fairs, you had state fairs, and you have big spaces that can be controlled to convey a message. During the war, the government wants to get a message out that a lot of the labor folks do at home can be kind of pivoted to support the war. Show them at expositions how they can do that. So throughout the summer and fall of 1918, you had a series of these kinds of wartime expositions. Los Angeles and Chicago were some of the biggest. If you see here, so again, this is Grant Park. This is from the State Archives. It says, bird's eye view from an airplane, U.S. government war exposition. Those who labored in support of farming and agriculture during this time, there were a lot of different programs to do that. One of them was called the Women's Land Army. So the Women's Land Army of Illinois was actually brought in, and what they do is they will design and dig these trenches. And what they're trying to do is make it look like a battleground in France. And again, this is going to happen in the first 2 weeks of September 1918. So they're making a mock version of a war that is still ongoing for the public. Soldiers were brought in from Rockford, from a U.S. Army camp there, and some of them were dressed up as German soldiers, some of them were allowed to keep their American uniforms, and they would have mock battles. There were planes that would have mock fights over downtown Chicago. And if you can see, down here, as well as to the left, you have what looks like sort of buildings or stalls, and these were common throughout this area to show off captured material from battlefields, but they were also there to showcase different government organizations that were involved in the process of the war. And what you would see is many of the stuff that had existed around Chicago kind of comes out here to further encourage the public to again get involved. So one of the places, or one of the things that they had there actually, was a demonstration kitchen. And those demonstration kitchens or demonstration spaces are not specific just to Chicago or Illinois, but you would see them in other parts of the country. So this actually was a canning demonstration space that was constructed, where the whole idea was individuals would can food here, and you as a member of the public could go see, kind of how is this being done, to possibly learn how to do it. Now, what I think is kind of interesting with this is, again, what are they demonstrating? Well, certain kinds of foods, certain kinds of ingredients are going to be strongly emphasized as, hey, we're not using those right now. Sugar specifically, certain kinds of proteins, beef specifically. The idea was, let's use potatoes instead of wheat. Let's use fish instead of beef, right? This kind of thing. So the recipes reflected these realities, and then the demonstration kitchens performed for Americans how they could engage with this kind of stuff. A big thing was consumption of bread. And so actually, if you look at the Illinois State Archives, there's a lot of photos of just loaves of bread. I always find that interesting, of like, what did you do in the war? I took pictures of bread. That was kind of interesting. So these are said war bread loaf number 1. But again, the recipes were a part of educational outreach to support conservation and how you could voluntarily conserve. But it wasn't always that voluntary. So the state supported things like Wheatless Wednesday, Meatless Monday, and again, they, yes, tried to get individuals interested in canning. And again, they had recipe books throughout the entirety of this time to convince folks of the importance of this and how you could have kind of a wraparound approach to behaviors that were normalized, where you could then get really active in conservation. So here is another one from the State Archives. The title of this cookbook is Camouflage, 27 Meatless Meat Recipes, which, I think is kind of fascinating. There were other ways. So if you weren't gonna, if you were gonna make these recipes, you might not have access to certain kinds of foods. So the presumption was maybe you should grow your own. So you actually had something called the National War Garden Commission. And the idea was they would work with school districts, and they worked with state councils and women's committees to support the process of Americans having their own gardens. Now, I know in World War II you have the victory garden dynamic. That process had gotten started in World War I, where the idea was, and so here is a newspaper from Rock Island. If you look at the top there, it says, "Here's a free garden hanger for your home." So the idea was, I believe that's the Rock Island Argus, I think, the newspaper. What you do is you cut that thing out and you stick it in your window. And so then that way, this was all about showing how you were being patriotic. And so this was a way for you to show how you were supportive of the war simply by having a garden. right? You were taking part in that process of voluntarism, right, during that particular time. And there are other ways you could too. So I was mentioning the Women's Land Army. So Illinois and many other states will have divisions of the Women's Land Army. And it'll operate in a whole bunch of ways, all right? In the case of Illinois, it's going to be run partly through the Women's Committee of the Council of Defense in the state. There will be a farm basically given over to the state. It'll be located in Libertyville. And the idea is that women would be able to go there and train in agricultural practices of 1917, 1918. Now, some of that had to do with the gendered roles of the day and the possibility of, are these women going to be deploying to farms like the Boys Working Reserve, or is the expectation that they'll be marrying farmers, right? There's a little bit of that. That's a part of it. But again, it existed, all right? It existed. There was also something called the Emergency Farm Labor Initiative. This was basically getting middle-class individuals who worked in urban areas like Chicago to come out to the farms in the fall of 1918 because they were so concerned about the process of being able to bring the harvest in. Now, I'm not as up on the geography of Libertyville, but that's actually a map. That's a layout of what the farm looked like and the different kinds of goods that they would produce. The Boys Working Reserve, they also had uniforms, and it was a pretty regimented process. You know, it was somewhat militarized, except for the fact that they, you know, of course, were not issued guns. So, all right. So you're having bread with not as much wheat. You're having fish instead of beef. What about consuming drinks? You know, what about consuming beverages and sort of that kind of thing, right? So alcohol, right, certainly is something that should be mentioned. The era of the First World War is the era in which prohibition is eventually going to be enacted. And there's a few elements with that that relate directly to both wartime and relate very directly to anti-immigrant sentiments that existed in the country at the time, all right? So during what was called the Punitive Expedition to Mexico, where U.S. forces went to Mexico and spent time between 1916 and into early 1917, the Wilson administration had sent forces with them, had sent, not forces, but sent individuals with them to kind of look through what U.S. Army camps were doing, and they got very concerned about the morality of U.S. soldiers, that they were too exposed to places where they could go to bars or possibly to areas where there would be sex workers or this kind of thing, and they were very concerned about this. And what ends up happening is you get what's called the Commission on Training Camp Activities during the war, because they're very concerned that the American soldier is not going to be moral enough to go to war. And so this is partly why the Salvation Army is going to have a big role to play. The YMCA and the YWCA are going to have a big role to play, where they're going to kind of craft and curate recreation for soldiers. And so the idea is no alcohol, no connections to other individuals, right? Part of it is also going to be concerns about alcohol consumption. Now, at the time, in the US, there is a significant amount of anti-Germanism that is going on. All right, so if someone was of German ancestry at this point or spoke German in public, for example, you might find yourself discriminated against. So there was a view that beer consumption specifically was an act that was possibly helping the German war effort. So if you read the newspapers of the time, what they'll say is like Miller Brewing Company, so the Chicago newspapers of the time, will say like, you know, Miller Brewing Company, if you're giving money to their beer consumption, that money is obviously going to the German government, and so we need to stop drinking beer. So you have this concern over morality, you have these private organizations, you have this anti-Germanism, you have a view that beer destroys wheat production and you could be sending more wheat overseas, and it leads directly to support for prohibition by the time the war comes to a close. Now, there's other factors there as well, absolutely. Temperance and other groups, are absolutely going to be involved. But I want to point out this particular image. So this is from the special collections from Norwich University. And one of the interesting aspects of this is supposed to be a town in Mexico. So the idea was they were attempting to showcase immorality. And their stereotyped image of immorality is a town in Mexico. Yeah, I know. Pretty racist, huh? And the idea was you would walk through that display, you would pass through this display, and go into a YMCA-approved space. And so what you would then see is this showcase of how moral the American force was being. So it's not simply just about curtailing drinking, right? It's about this idea of morality, too. So, to kind of bring it to an end, because I know we're getting short on time, here's a food truck, a patriotic bread truck for Americans during this time of war. So conservation was a big deal. Food conservation was a big deal. The Americans throughout the time of the First World War were actively encouraged to do their part and to be able to transform their sort of common labors or behaviors. But they're doing so in a way where if they don't, their patriotism is kind of called in, not kind of, it is totally called into question. And so the question of are you being loyal was often tied to things like what are you drinking, what are you not drinking, or which recipes are you actually making at home. All right. Thank you all. I'll answer any questions if anybody has any questions. Thank you. Any questions? Yes.
Yeah, to what extent was America pretty much possible for, was it the main drive of food for the other countries and the Allies? How much was America, this place wouldn't survive, the war would continue without America?
So particularly, I think my understanding of the question was kind of how much is America actually doing, right? I can't give you a specific figure, but I can say that they're doing a lot. So England particularly doesn't produce the majority of its own food. They have to import it. And it's not just America specifically. So it's going to be the US, it's going to be Canada, and it's going to be the many, many nations across Latin America specifically. If you look at some of the propaganda of that era, what they will argue is that it's some of the food that's going to come up from, the Americas, and then it's going to be sent over from either the US or Canada to make it to France and to make it there. So a lot of it's going to go on American ships, and it's going to get that way. So in particular, Illinois, they produce more agriculture in 1918 than any other state. So they have a big role to play with this. We don't provide all of the food, but it absolutely does help. I guess that would be sort of my response to that question. Other questions? Yeah.
Did we also lend lease to the Russian Empire food and weapons?
That's World War II. Yeah, World War II is we're very much involved with the Lend-Lease process and sort of all of that. Yeah, by the time you get into 1917 for the First World War, you're going to have the Russian Revolution. Russia's going to pull out of the war, that kind of thing. But Lend-Lease, to your point, absolutely is a critical part of understanding logistics and the wartime experiences between what would become the Soviet Union and the US. Much of the process of equipping the Soviet army during the Second World War is very much due to the output of the Americans. The Americans, the figure is it's somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4. We provide 2/3 to 3/4 of everything for all of the Allies in World War II. So it's absolutely central. Yeah, absolutely. Now, we're not the only ones. The Canadians have a version of a Lend-Lease as well, and there's a few others, but we have a very big role to play with that. Others? Questions? Yes?
Yeah, was America's main contributing factor like the distribution of weapons, food, or did they see like significant combat? Because I know they weren't in the war for very long.
We're not in the war for very long, no. A way that I've sort of often describe it is think of it a little bit like, to make it somewhat as a baseball reference, think of it like relief pitching. We kind of come in towards the end and provide some assistance, but we're not fully responsible for the entirety of it. So yeah, part of it is going to be we can ramp up food supplies pretty quickly, right, within the context of a year, right? We can harvest stuff and then send it out, right? We can just deploy it. In terms of the amount of combat that we're seeing, the figure is on the Western Front specifically somewhere around but just a little over 20%, right? So the Allied Western Front, we're a little over 20% of the line of battle by the time you get to the end of the war. So we're going to be there. We're going to be a part of that process. But much of that is undertaken by the British, the French, and many other nations as well. Yes?
So would you say that there were any like commercial interests that were like motivated to promote these types of demonstrations? Like were they benefiting?
Well, so they're going to be directly encouraged. So the question was about commercial interests and kind of what connections are they going to have. You're certainly going to see food production companies support the idea of patriotism, right? And food patriotism and that kind of stuff. So if you think of like the stockyards in Chicago, right? The armor company or sort of that kind of thing. What I do have evidence of is of them being very active, let's say, in selling tickets to go to the wartime expositions. And if you look at the ads of that era, you're certainly going to see companies that are going to encourage you, come here, you can buy our stuff. Or you'll have wartime ads that'll reflect the nature of war, right? So an example might be, so prohibition is coming, right? It's going to come, but there's concern that it may or may not. So you're going to get, say, for example, the Budweiser Corporation that is going to have ads at the time that are going to be like, we think our beer is great, but moderation is important too. So, they're trying to kind of still get the word out, still be patriotic, but also reflect the time period, right? So a lot of it you'll see, at least in the public eye, is that idea of here's how by buying our product you're being a good patriot, right? Or here's how we as a company are supporting the war effort, you can too, right? Those kinds of messages you're going to see at that time. It's a great question, Alex. Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah?
Did the rationing affect the cuisine of America at the time? Because I know during World War II, since the Blitzkrieg, it was so bad in Britain, that kind of rationing still goes on today, which is why the food is kind of, potatoes. Did that affect America as well?
Yeah, so it's not straight rationing, right? It's not legally structured rationing, right? It's the idea is that it's voluntary. And the idea is that you're going to inform the public, don't consume these things, and so you're going to find less access to them. But then the expectation would be, if you consume those things that you're not supposed to be consuming, and you're going to consume them in public, you could find yourself in trouble. So, yes, it absolutely affects the cuisine. It absolutely affects what's going to be on offer, because Americans are very concerned that if they're cooking with items that they're not supposed to be cooking with, they could find themselves in trouble. So, for example, if a restaurant all of a sudden is serving meat on a meatless Monday because, they don't want waste and they don't want things to go bad, that's still in violation of kind of that local voluntary patriotic sentiment. So what'll happen is the state will make use of those auxiliary resources, right? Those additional resources that I was mentioning earlier, like the American Protective League, where their agents or others would kind of go around to that restaurant and be like, hey, we heard from someone who was here on Monday and y'all serve meat. What's going on with that? Aren't you pro-war? What are you doing here? And there would be these conversations where they could find themselves in trouble. And so they wanted to make sure they were taking actions to avoid perceptions of, being accused of being disloyal, because you kind of really didn't want to be accused of being disloyal. And so, yeah.
Basically, it was kind
Oh, there's a huge stigma to it. Yeah, absolutely. And so, but because part of it, particularly with food consumption, is how do you check, right? How do you check to make sure, right, that someone isn't consuming something, right, that they're not doing it privately? So a lot of it's going to be done in public spaces where things are consumed. Is that stigma of consuming it in public, right, is where stuff can be placed. And so you would have individuals kind of write into the state expressing these concerns over, you know, this restaurant did this, we think that's a problem, or this school served this at lunchtime, we think that's a problem, go check it out. Oh yeah, I mean, anything like this of the question of state-approved loyalty, it often relies on the idea of folks informing on one another, and that very much was the case during World War I, at least in America. So. Yeah, I mean, and a lot of other different kinds of governments, the idea of where you're relying on this idea of continual enforcing of behavior, right? Where the idea being that you don't have a great ability to check and see how it's done, that you're absolutely going to rely on folks informing on one another, right? So part of it, so, you know, we talked about food here. There were also things like fuel administrations. And so there would be these efforts to, like, for example, not have businesses be open past a certain hour, or businesses be open on certain days of the week, right? Like no gas station be open on Sunday, you know, for example, I'm broadly speculating. But then what you'd have is, let's say a random gas station happens to decide we're actually going to open up on Sunday. What'll happen is folks will write in and express their frustration. The reason I'm mentioning that one is because, at least in the case of Illinois, I've read letters where there were random gas stations that would be open on a particular day, and their neighbors would see that they were open, and they'd write into the state, and they'd go, hey, you know, Fred, who runs this, isn't being a good American. He's not being loyal. He had his gas station open on Sunday. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's very much an encourage to inform out of loyalty winning out. So. Any other questions? Great dialogue. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you. Take care. Take care. Thank you.